The drought had turned the New Mexico territory into a graveyard of broken promises. For Sarah Caldwell, the parched earth of her husband's grave was just one more reminder that mercy came at a price she could no longer afford. With only one aging horse and an empty well, the widow had given up praying for rain. But that night, when the wounded Apache warrior collapsed at her fence line, she gave away her last lifeline without knowing that by dawn, the dry valley would thunder with the hooves of 30 wild Mustangs, payment for a kindness that would change the territory forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Heat shimmered across the cracked earth of Salvation Valley, a name that had become a mockery to the few stubborn souls who still called it home. The year was 1887, and the territory had seen no meaningful rain in 18 months. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered timber of Sarah Caldwell's homestead, the only structure standing for miles across the barren landscape. At 42, Sarah had outlived not only her husband, but the dreams that had brought them west from Pennsylvania 7 years earlier. She stood at the edge of her property, one hand shielding her eyes from the relentless glare, watching as Samson, her only remaining horse, pawed listlessly at the ground. The once proud Appaloosa had grown thin, his ribs visible beneath a dull coat that had lost its luster months ago. Like everything else on the homestead, he was slowly dying. "Just a little longer, old friend," Sarah murmured, running a calloused hand down his neck. The marshal promised supply wagons by week's end, but promises meant little in this forsaken place. 4 months earlier, when Thomas had succumbed to the fever that swept through the scattered homesteads, the neighbors had promised to check on her. None had returned after the burial. 3 weeks ago, the last family on the adjoining property had loaded their wagon before dawn and disappeared eastward without a word of farewell. Sarah didn't blame them. Only a fool or a widow with nowhere else to go would remain in this purgatory between civilization and wilderness. Inside the cabin, the temperature dropped only slightly. Sarah moved methodically, conserving energy as she prepared her evening meal. A thin stew made from the last of her preserved vegetables and a handful of dried beans. No meat tonight. No meat for nearly 2 weeks now. Samson was too valuable for hunting expeditions into the foothills where game might still be found. As she stirred the meager broth, her gaze drifted to Thomas's rifle mounted above the door, loaded and ready as he'd always kept it. Beside it hung a faded daguerreotype of their wedding day. She barely recognized the hopeful young woman in the image, her dark hair arranged elaborately beneath a lace veil, eyes bright with promise. "You always said the rains would come," she said to the empty room. "I'm still waiting, Thomas." The sound of her own voice startled her. She spoke aloud, less frequently now, the silence of the valley having seeped into her bones. Some days she wondered if she'd forgotten how to form words altogether, becoming as mute as the parched landscape. The single window faced west, offering a view of the sun's descent behind the distant mesas. Sarah had once found the sunsets beautiful, all crimson and gold painting the sandstone cliffs. Now each one marked another day of survival, another night of solitude, another sunset closer to the decision she'd been avoiding, to abandon everything they had built and head east to her sister's home in St. Louis. We see Thomas and Sarah arriving. At the empty valley 7 years earlier, his face alight with visions of the cattle ranch they would build. The land agent had shown them maps of underground springs, promised fertile soil and moderate temperatures. For 3 years it had been true. Enough rain fell to grow crops, the small herd of cattle thrived, and they added a sturdy barn to the property. Thomas had been respected among the scattered settlers, known for his fair dealings and willingness to help newcomers. Sarah had established a small orchard selling apple preserves to passing wagon trains. They weren't wealthy, but they were building something that was entirely their own. Then the drought began, subtle at first, just a drier than usual spring, then a summer of cloudless skies. By the second year, the cattle had to be sold off, the orchard trees withered, and the neighboring homesteaders began to drift away. Thomas grew quieter, spending days riding the perimeter of their land, searching for any sign of moisture. The last time he'd gone out, he'd returned with the fever. Sarah finished her stew, scraping the bowl clean with a piece of hardtack that had to be soaked before she could chew it. As darkness settled across the valley, she performed her nightly ritual, checking the empty rain barrel, securing the cabin door, and ensuring Samson was safely in the small corral behind the house. The horse was all she had left of value: transportation, potential emergency food, and her only companion. In the desolation, water enough for one more day, she told the horse, pouring a carefully measured amount into his trough. Then we'll have to try the creek bed again. The creek was little more than a memory now, a dry scar in the earth where water had once flowed freely. But occasionally, if one dug deep enough in certain spots, a small amount of muddy water would seep up from the underground table, barely enough for one woman and one horse to survive on. Sleep came fitfully that night, as it always did. The silence of the valley was too complete, broken only by the occasional distant howl of coyotes. Sarah lay on the narrow bed she'd once shared with Thomas, listening to the wind find its way through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying dust that settled on every surface. Tomorrow she would need to sweep again, an endless battle against the encroaching desert. It was near midnight when Samson's distressed whinny jolted her awake. Sarah sat up instantly, years of frontier life having honed her instincts. The horse rarely made noise after dark. Something was wrong. She reached for Thomas's rifle and moved silently to the window, peering out into the moonlit yard. At first, she saw nothing unusual. The corral gate remained closed, Samson pacing nervously. Inside! Then a shadow moved near the fence line, not the familiar slinking shape of a coyote, but something larger. Human. Her finger tensed on the trigger. Raiders were rare this far from the main trails, but desperation drove men to extremes in these harsh times. She'd heard stories from passing traders about homesteaders robbed of their last provisions, women left alone, particularly vulnerable. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm armed, and I won't hesitate to shoot." The figure staggered forward into a shaft of moonlight, then collapsed heavily to the ground, not charging toward the house, not attempting to breach the corral, just falling, as if the last reserves of strength had finally given out. Sarah waited, counting her heartbeats, watching for movement. When none came, she lit a lantern, and, rifle still ready, stepped cautiously onto the porch. The night air carried the bite of autumn, a reminder that winter would soon add its hardships to the drought. She advanced slowly toward the fallen figure, lantern held high. As the light illuminated the scene, her breath caught. The man lay face down, in the dust, one arm outstretched toward the corral, as if reaching for help. Even in the dim light, she could see he was Native American, his long black hair, bronze skin, and clothing marking him as one of the Apache from the reservation to the north. But it was the spreading dark stain on his side that commanded her. Attention, blood, fresh enough to glisten in the lantern light. Sarah hesitated. Relations between settlers and the native tribes were complex and often dangerous. Thomas had maintained cautious but respectful dealings with the Apache, who occasionally passed through their land, trading goods and leaving each other in peace. But that was before the drought drove everyone to desperation. The wounded man hadn't moved since falling. She could simply return to the cabin, bar the door, and wait until morning. If he survived the night, she could decide then what to do. If not, the problem would solve itself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The practical choice was clear, yet as she turned to go, the man made a soft sound. Not quite a word, barely even a moan, just an exhalation of pain that somehow cut through all her caution. Sarah found herself kneeling beside him, setting the rifle within reach, but placing the lantern closer to examine his wound. "Can you hear me?" she asked, gently turning him onto his back. His face was young, younger than she'd expected, perhaps no more than 30. High cheekbones, strong features now tightened with pain. His breathing came in shallow gasps, and his eyes remained closed. The wound in his side was a bullet hole, the edges ragged and inflamed. Not fresh, perhaps 2 days old, but untreated and now infected. He needed medicine, clean bandages, water they couldn't spare, and food they didn't have. Helping him meant depleting her own meager supplies, hastening the inevitable moment when she would have to abandon the homestead or perish with it. Sarah sat back on her heels, the practical calculus of survival warring with something deeper, a humanity the harsh landscape had nearly scoured away. She looked at the stranger's face again, and for a moment saw a shadow of Thomas in the final days of his fever. She had been helpless then, watching her husband slip away despite her desperate efforts. "Damn it all," she whispered. Decision made. With strength born of years of hard labor, she managed to half-drag, half-carry the unconscious man to the cabin. Inside, she laid him on the bearskin rug before the cold hearth, unwilling to place a stranger in her bed, but unable to leave him. On the bare floor, she built a small fire using precious kindling and set water to boil. By lantern light, she cut away the bloodied fabric around his wound and cleaned it as best she could. The man flinched, but didn't wake, his skin burning with fever. Among Thomas's things, she found a bottle of whiskey saved for medicinal purposes, and used some to disinfect the wound before packing it with the last of her dried yarrow leaves. Through the night, she kept vigil, periodically spooning water between his cracked lips, watching for any sign of improvement. By dawn, his breathing had steadied slightly, but the fever still raged. Sarah stepped outside to tend to Samson, her eyes gritty from lack of sleep. The eastern sky had begun to lighten, the stars fading into the pale blue that preceded sunrise. Another cloudless day, another day without rain. The horse nickered softly as she approached, pushing his nose against her shoulder in greeting. She stroked his neck, her mind working through rapidly diminishing options. The wounded Apache needed more care than she could provide. The nearest doctor was in the town of Copper Springs, nearly 30 miles away. Too far to walk in her exhausted state, carrying a wounded man. There was only one possibility. "I'm sorry, old friend," she whispered to Samson. "I need you one last time." She saddled the horse with Thomas's best saddle, securing a water skin and what little food she could spare in the saddlebags. Then she returned to the cabin and somehow managed to get the semi-conscious Apache onto his feet, half walking, half dragging him to where Samson waited. "Stay still," she commanded, though she wasn't sure he understood. With considerable effort, she helped him mount, then tied his hands to the saddle horn to ensure he wouldn't fall. The Apache's eyes flickered open briefly, confusion and pain evident in the dark depths. "Copper Springs," Sarah said clearly, pointing east. "Doctor, you understand? Copper Springs." She wasn't sure if any of her words registered, but when she stepped back and slapped Samson's flank, the horse began moving obediently toward the eastern trail. The wounded man swayed dangerously, but remained mounted, his body seeming to instinctively adjust to the horse's rhythm, even in his fevered state. Sarah stood in the yard, watching as her last connection to Thomas, her final means of escape, and her only companion disappeared over the ridge with a stranger she'd likely never see again. "Fool woman," she muttered to herself, turning back to the now empty cabin. Without Samson, she had perhaps a week before she would need to leave on foot, assuming she could carry enough water to make it to the next settlement. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah forced herself to sleep for a few hours, then spent the afternoon taking inventory of her remaining supplies. By her calculations, she had food for 5 days if she stretched it thin. Water was the greater concern. Without Samson, she couldn't transport enough from the distant creek bed to last more than a day or two. When evening came, she found herself standing at the fence line where the Apache had fallen, staring east, as if she might somehow see what had become of horse and rider. Had they reached Copper Springs? Had the man succumbed to his wound along the way, leaving Samson riderless and vulnerable to thieves or predators? Had she sacrificed her last lifeline for nothing? "You'd have done the same," she said aloud, as if Thomas could hear her justification. "You always said we don't measure the worth of mercy by what it returns to us." But Thomas had said many things that the drought had proven false. As darkness fell across the valley once more, Sarah retreated to the cabin and barred the door against the night, and against the growing certainty that she had just sealed her own fate. She slept poorly, dreams filled with the sound of hoofbeats that always receded when she tried to follow them. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, she rose wearily, her body aching from the previous day's exertions. She kindled a small fire, heated water for coffee made from twice-used grounds, and tried to focus on practical matters rather than regrets. The sound, when it came, was so faint she thought she'd imagined it, a distant rumble like far-off thunder. Sarah froze, coffee cup halfway to her lips. Thunder meant clouds, clouds meant potential rain. She hurried to the door and flung it open, eyes scanning the horizon for storm clouds. The sky remained a clear, mocking blue, but the rumble continued, growing louder, coming from the east. Not thunder. Hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats. Sarah shaded her eyes against the rising sun, watching as a cloud of dust approached from the direction of Copper Springs. A rider appeared, silhouetted against the morning light, moving at a steady pace, directly toward the homestead. Behind him something else, a flowing mass of movement that resolved itself into a sight she could scarcely comprehend. Horses, dozens of them. Wild mustangs in varying colors, blacks, bays, pintos, duns, running in formation behind the lead rider like a living river across the parched landscape. And as the rider drew closer, Sarah recognized the straight-backed figure, no longer swaying with weakness but sitting tall in the saddle. The Apache warrior, mounted on Samson, leading a herd of wild mustangs directly to her doorstep. She stood frozen in disbelief as they approached, dust billowing around them like the answer to a prayer she'd stopped saying months ago. The mustangs circled the homestead once, their hooves throwing up clouds of dust that painted the morning air golden. Sarah remained rooted in place, one hand gripping the doorframe for support as the Apache warrior guided Samson directly to the front of the cabin. Up close, the transformation was even more remarkable. Though still lean, the man sat tall and composed, no trace of the fever that had ravaged him just days before. He dismounted with fluid grace, one hand resting briefly on Samson's neck in what appeared to be gratitude. The horse looked better than when Sarah had sent him away, coat shinier, eyes brighter, as if he'd been well cared for despite the journey. The Apache approached her slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. His dark eyes studied her face, neither threatening nor particularly friendly, simply observing. Up close, Sarah could see the wound in his side had been professionally treated, fresh bandages visible beneath his leather vest. "You found the doctor," she said, breaking the silence. The man nodded once, then gestured toward the herd of mustangs that had settled into a loose formation behind him, some grazing on the sparse dry grass, others watching with alert eyes. "For you," he said, his English accented but clear. "Payment for life." Sarah stared at him, then at the mustangs. At least 30 of them, each one worth more than everything she owned combined. In this drought-stricken territory, horses meant transportation, labor, trade goods, survival. "I don't understand," she said. "I only gave you one horse." A hint of something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. One horse, one life. He touched the freshly bandaged wound at his side. Fair trade. Before she could respond, he reached into a pouch at his waist and extended his hand. In his palm lay a small leather pouch. When she hesitated, he simply placed it on. The porch railing between them. "My name is Nakohe," he said. "It means skilled tracker in my language." "Sarah Caldwell," she replied automatically, still struggling to comprehend the situation. Nakohe nodded, as if committing the name to memory. "The horses need water." He glanced toward her empty rain barrel, then back at her face. "I know where." Sarah followed his gaze to the herd, then back to the parched valley stretching around them. Water was the most precious commodity in Salvation Valley, more valuable than gold or horses. The creek bed had been dry for months, the well producing barely enough for one person and a single horse. 30 Mustangs would need gallons daily. "There's no water here," she said, gesturing to the barren landscape. "The creek's been dry since spring. The well's failing. That's why everyone left." Nakohe's expression didn't change. "Not everyone." He looked at her steadily. "And there is water. Deep." He pointed toward the foothills that rose in the distance, beyond the boundaries of her property. "I will show you." Sarah had expected to feel vulnerable on the back of a Mustang instead of Samson's familiar gait. But the dun-colored mare Nakohe had chosen for her moved with surprising gentleness. She rode behind him, watching his straight back, the way he guided his mount with minimal movements, as if horse and rider shared a single mind. The herd spread out behind and around them, moving like a living ocean across the valley floor. Some of the Mustangs bore markings she'd never seen, splash patterns of white across dark coats, unusual dappling, one with a coat so black it seemed to absorb the sunlight. "Where did they come from?" she asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for nearly an hour. Nakohe pointed northwest, toward mountains that were merely blue shadows on the horizon. "Shadow Canyon, where Apache horses run free." "You captured all these yourself?" Sarah couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. He shook his head. "Not captured, asked." Before she could question this strange statement, he raised a hand, signaling halt. They had reached a section of the foothills Sarah had never explored, a jumble of rock formations that looked impassable. Thomas had always said there was nothing of value beyond this point, that only the main valley was worth claiming. Nakohe dismounted and waited for her to do the same. He took a leather water skin from his horse and handed it to her. "Drink, then follow." The water was cool and tasted faintly of minerals. Sarah drank sparingly out of habit, then watched as Nakohe moved confidently toward what appeared to be a solid rock wall. Only when he disappeared between two boulders did she realize there was a narrow passage hidden in the stone. She hesitated, years of frontier caution making her wary. She was alone with a stranger, an Apache warrior with unknown intentions, far from any settlement. The sensible choice would be to mount her horse and return to the homestead. But she had passed the point of sensible choices the moment she'd opened her door to a wounded man in the night. Sarah secured her horse's reins and followed Nakohe into the passage. The path twisted through towering rock walls, forcing her to turn sideways in the narrowest sections. Ahead, she could hear Nakohe's steady footsteps, but could no longer see him. Just as claustrophobia began to tighten her chest, the passage widened suddenly, opening into a grotto hidden entirely from the outside world. Sarah stopped, momentarily stunned by what lay before her. A pool of clear water, perhaps 30 feet across, fed by a small waterfall that trickled down the rock face. Around the edges grew plants she hadn't seen in months, green, living things that had somehow survived the drought. The air felt different here, Cooler, damp, alive, Nakohe stood at the edge of the pool, watching her reaction. "Water," he said simply, "hidden but always flowing. This has been here all along." Sarah moved to the water's edge, dipping her fingers into the coolness. "How did you know about it? Apache have known for generations. Sacred place." He knelt and filled a wooden cup from his pack, offering it to her. "Taste." The water was unlike any she'd had in Salvation Valley, sweet, cold, without the mineral tang of well water. It tasted like life itself. "Why show me this place?" she asked. "Why not keep it secret?" Nakohe considered her question, his expression thoughtful. "You gave life without question, without knowing who I was." He gestured to the pool. "Water is like mercy. It should flow freely." They returned with leather bags filled with water from the hidden spring, enough to fill Sarah's empty rain barrel and water troughs that Nakohe fashioned from half-barrels found in the abandoned barn. The Mustangs drank gratefully, their presence transforming the desolate homestead into something that resembled a working ranch once more. As the sun began its descent, Sarah found herself in the unfamiliar position of preparing a meal for someone other than herself. She had added extra beans to the pot, along with the last of her dried corn. It wasn't much, but hospitality demanded she offer something to the man who had brought this miracle of horses and water to her doorstep. "They'll need proper corrals," she said, as she stirred the pot hanging over the fire. "If you intend them to stay—" Nakohe sat on the porch steps, carving something from a piece of wood with a small knife. He looked up at her words. "They are yours now. You decide if they stay." Sarah paused, the implications sinking in. 30 Mustangs. With horses like these, she could rebuild everything, start breeding stock, trade some for cattle, create a ranch that could withstand future droughts. Now that she knew about the hidden spring, "Why give them to me?" she asked. "You could have taken them anywhere, sold them in any town. They're worth a small fortune." Nakohe continued his carving, seemingly absorbed in the task. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. 3 days ago, I was dying, shot by a cavalry soldier who claimed I stole from the supply wagon." He looked up at her. "I did not steal. I was hunting deer on ancestral lands. The soldier did not ask, just shot." He set the carving aside, the emerging shape of a horse in miniature. "I ran until my strength was gone. When I fell at your fence, I expected to die there." His eyes held hers steadily. "Instead, you gave me shelter, treated my wound. Then, gave your only horse so I might live. This is a debt that must be honored." The simple dignity in his words silenced any further questions. Sarah served the humble stew in 2 bowls, and they ate in a companionable silence as twilight deepened around the homestead. The Mustangs settled for the night, their occasional, soft nickering carrying on the evening breeze. After the meal, Sarah remembered the leather pouch Nakohe had placed on the railing. She retrieved it and loosened the drawstring. Inside were several packets of dried herbs and a folded piece of paper with instructions written in a doctor's precise hand. Treatments for infection, fever, wound care. "You saw the doctor in Copper Springs," she said, looking up from the herbs. Nakohe shook his head. "Not safe for Apache and white settlements now. Too much anger since the last raids." He touched his bandaged side. "Medicine woman in my tribe. Better than white doctor for some wounds." Sarah carefully refolded the paper. "Did you tell her about me?" "I told her about a woman who values life over caution." His expression remained neutral, but something in his tone suggested approval. "She sent these for when you need healing." The conversation lapsed into silence again, but it was a different kind of silence than what Sarah had grown accustomed to in her solitude. This had texture to it, a sense of shared space rather than emptiness. As darkness fell completely, practical matters reasserted themselves. "You can sleep in the barn," she offered, gesturing to the structure that had stood empty since the cattle were sold. It's not much, but there's clean straw. Nakohe shook his head. I will sleep with the horses tonight. He stood and gathered his few possessions. At dawn, I will show you how to approach them. Each has a different spirit. Sarah watched him walk toward the makeshift corral, where the mustangs greeted him with soft wickers of recognition. There was an easy confidence in how he moved among them, touching a nose here, a flank there, speaking in low tones in his native language. She should have been afraid. Everything she'd been taught about survival in these territories warned against. Trusting too easily, especially someone from a tribe that had raided settlements in the past. Yet as she watched Nakohe spread his blanket beneath the stars, surrounded by the mustangs, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, a tentative sense of possibility. Sarah woke before sunrise, her mind strangely clear despite the tumultuous events of the previous day. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Nakohe already awake, sitting cross-legged on a flat rock near the corral, facing the eastern horizon, where the first hint of dawn tinged the sky. He didn't acknowledge her presence, and something in his posture, the stillness, the intent focus, told Sarah this was a private ritual. She busied herself with morning chores, starting a fire in the cook stove, measuring out precious coffee beans for brewing. When she looked up again, Nakohe had risen and was walking toward the house, the first rays of sunlight illuminating his profile. You rise early, he observed. Farm habit, she replied. Can't seem to break it even when there's no farm left to tend. His gaze swept over the withered orchard, the empty garden plot, the fallow fields. The land is not dead. Only waiting. He nodded toward the coffee pot. That smells good. She poured 2 cups, surprised by how easily they fell into this domestic routine, as if sharing morning coffee with an Apache warrior was something she did regularly. They drank in silence, watching the sun climb higher, burning away the pre-dawn. Bist, I need to return to my people soon, Nakohe said finally. But first, the horses. The morning passed in a blur of activity as Nakohe taught Sarah about each mustang in the herd. He showed her how to approach them, slowly, confidently, with respect for their individual temperaments. Each horse had a name in his language, which he translated for her. Night sky for the black stallion with white flecking like stars, dawn singer for the chestnut mare who nickered at first light, stone runner for the grey gelding with remarkable speed. This one, he said, bringing forward the dun mare Sarah had ridden yesterday. She is gentle spirit, good for everyday riding, steady. Sarah ran a hand down the mare's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the smooth coat. She's beautiful. She chose you, Nakohe said matter-of-factly. Yesterday when we prepared to ride, she stepped forward for you. Sarah looked at him skeptically. The horses choose their riders? A rare smile crossed his face, transforming his serious features. Of course. Did you think it was the other way around? He continued through the herd, pointing out the best horses for different purposes, which would pull a plough, which could carry heavy loads, which were fastest for long distances. He demonstrated techniques for calming nervous animals, for establishing trust, for communicating, intent through body language rather than force. Sarah absorbed everything, asking questions, practicing what he showed her. The knowledge was different from what Thomas had taught her about domesticated farm horses. These mustangs required a different approach, partnership rather than dominance. By midday, she had successfully handled 6 of the gentler horses and had begun to recognize the distinct personalities in the herd. The work was exhausting, but exhilarating. For the first time in months, she was building something rather than merely surviving. They paused to eat a simple meal of corn cakes and dried beef that Nakohe produced from his supplies. Sitting in the shade of the barn, Sarah became aware of how much had changed in just 2 days. The homestead no longer felt abandoned. There was purpose again, movement, life. "You're good with them," Nakohe observed, nodding toward the horses. "You listen before you act." "My father raised horses in Pennsylvania," Sarah replied, "before the war took him. He always said horses can sense fear and impatience better than any creature God made." Nakohe nodded in agreement. "Wise man." He studied her for a moment. "Like father, like daughter." The simple acknowledgement of her competence, of her connection to her father's legacy, touched something deep in Sarah. For months, she had seen herself only as a widow, a survivor, a woman alone against elements that seemed determined to break her. Nakohe saw something else: capability, strength, continuity. "What will you do with them?" he asked, gesturing toward the Mustangs. Sarah considered the question. "Build a proper ranch if I can. Breed them. Sell some, keep the best. Maybe get cattle again when the rains return." She looked at the clear sky, still defiantly cloudless. "If the rains return." "They will," Nakohe said with certainty. "The elders say this drought nears its end. The signs are there for those who know how to read them." "What signs?" He pointed to a distant stand of cottonwoods near the dry creek bed. "The trees, new growth at the tips of branches. They sense water returning to the deep places." He indicated a patch of wildflowers that had suddenly appeared near the corral. "These bloom only before rains come." Sarah had been so focused on survival that she'd stopped looking for such subtle indicators. "How long?" she asked. "How long until the rains?" "Before the first snow." He looked toward the mountains. "Perhaps 6 weeks. Not long. 6 weeks." She could last 6 weeks now, with access to the hidden spring, with horses to trade if necessary, with renewed purpose. As the afternoon progressed, Nakohe showed her how to use a rope to guide the Mustangs without breaking their spirit, how to recognize signs of health or distress, how to establish herself as part of the herd rather than merely its owner. The lessons were practical, but contained a philosophy entirely different from the frontier mentality of conquering and taming. "The Apache believe horses carry messages from the spirit world," he explained, as they sat resting after working with a particularly spirited young stallion. "They choose to work with us, not for us. When you understand this, they will give you their strength freely." Sarah thought about Thomas's approach to horses, kind but dominant, always establishing himself as master. This was different, a relationship of mutual respect rather than hierarchy. "Your husband," Nakohe said suddenly. "The one in the picture inside. He was a good man." The unexpected question caught Sarah off guard. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Hard-working. Fair. He had dreams for this place." Nakohe nodded. "His spirit is still here, in the fence posts, the orchard trees, the way you face each day." The simple observation threatened to break the careful control Sarah had maintained since Thomas's death. She looked away, focusing on the distant mountains, until she could trust her voice again. "Tomorrow I must go," Nakohe said, seemingly unaware of her emotional struggle. "My people will be concerned." Sarah nodded, surprised by the disappointment that washed through her at his words. "Of course, you've done more than enough already." She gestured to the Mustangs. "This is more than I could ever repay." "There is no debt between us now," he said firmly, "but there is one thing more I must show you before I leave." They rode to the hidden spring once more, this time bringing empty barrels to transport water back to the homestead. Sarah had become more comfortable on gentle spirit, the dun mare responding to her lightest touch as if they'd been partners for years rather than hours. After filling the barrels, Nakohe led her farther into the rock formation, following a narrow path that twisted upward through the stone. The climb was steep, requiring them to dismount and lead the horses carefully over the rough terrain. Just as Sarah was about to ask where they were going, the path leveled out and opened onto a plateau overlooking the entire valley. From this height, She could see her homestead in the distance, the ribbon of the dry creek bed, the rolling expanse of parched grassland stretching to the horizon, and most surprisingly, the faint green line where an underground water source must still be feeding the deepest-rooted trees despite the drought. "Look," Nakohe said, pointing westward. "Your land, all of it." Sarah had never seen the valley from this perspective before. Despite the drought's devastation, there was a stark beauty to it, the play of light and shadow across the landscape, the subtle variations in color and texture, the promise of what could be when water returned. The Apache call this place the Mother's Hand, Nakohe said, tracing the shape of the valley with his finger. 5 canyons like fingers, feeding one valley. When rains come, water flows from all directions into this land. The soil remembers, even when dry. Sarah looked more carefully and saw what he meant. 5 distinct drainages that would funnel water into her valley when the rains eventually returned. The homestead sat at the palm of this natural hand. "Thomas chose well," she said softly, "even if he didn't know why." Nakohe nodded. "Some people hear the land speak without knowing they listen." He turned to face her. "Remember this view. When doubts come, when work seems too difficult, remember what waits beneath the surface." They stood in silence as the sun began its descent, painting the landscape in amber and gold. In that moment, with the valley spread before her and the mustangs grazing peacefully nearby, Sarah felt something she had thought lost forever, hope not just for survival, but for a future worth building. Nakohe departed at dawn 3 days later, not immediately as he'd first planned. The delay wasn't explained directly, but Sarah suspected it had to do with the way he'd studied the healing wound on her hand, a deep gash from repairing the corral, and insisted on teaching her how to properly use the medicine woman's herbs. Or perhaps it was his determination to ensure she could handle the Mustang stallion he called Thunder Voice, the natural leader of the herd whose cooperation would be essential for managing the others. Whatever his reasons, those additional days proved invaluable. By the time he mounted his horse to leave, Sarah had absorbed more practical knowledge about survival in this harsh territory than she'd gained in 7 years of homesteading. "Remember," Nakohe said as he prepared to depart, adjusting the minimal provisions she'd insisted he take. "The horses understand more than you think. Speak to them with respect, not just commands." Sarah nodded, standing in the yard that now bustled with equine activity. "I'll remember." Nakohe hesitated, then reached into his pouch and withdrew something, wrapped in soft leather. He handed it to her without ceremony. "For protection." Sarah unwrapped it to find a knife unlike any she'd seen before. The blade curved slightly, the handle carved from antler and inlaid with turquoise. It was clearly a treasured possession, not something one gave to a stranger. "I can't accept this," she began. "You already have," he replied simply, then mounted his horse in one fluid motion. "I will return before the winter moon to see how the herd fares." With that, he rode eastward, not looking back, his straight figure gradually diminishing against the horizon until he disappeared altogether. Sarah stood watching long after he'd gone, the knife in her hand a solid reminder that the extraordinary events of the past days had not been a dream born of desperation. The transformation began slowly, then gathered momentum like a stone rolling downhill. With access to the hidden spring and 30 mustangs as both workforce and assets, Sarah's focus shifted from mere survival to ambitious renewal. First came securing the herd. The existing corral could barely contain a quarter of the mustangs, so Sarah set about expanding it, working from dawn until her muscles screamed for relief. She salvaged lumber from abandoned neighboring homesteads, dragging it back with the help of Thunder Voice, who proved to be unexpectedly cooperative once she applied Nakohe's methods of communication. The days fell into a new rhythm. Mornings, spent working with the horses, establishing trust and learning their individual temperaments. Afternoons devoted to rebuilding infrastructure, repairing the barn roof, constructing additional corrals, clearing irrigation channels in anticipation of the rains Nachkohe had promised would come. Evenings found her exhausted, but purposeful, recording the day's progress in a journal she'd abandoned months earlier. The entries evolved from terse notes about horse behavior to more expansive reflections on her changing circumstances. October 12, 1887. Gentle spirit now comes when I whistle, even from across the pasture. Thunder voice still tests boundaries, but responds to the hand signals Nachkohe taught me. Completed the North Corral extension today, hands blistered but healing with the herb poultice. The hidden spring continues to provide enough water, though hauling it remains time-consuming. October 18th, 1887. Traded 2 of the younger geldings to Jacob Whitman from the Copper Springs Mercantile. In return, 6 months' worth of provisions, seed for spring planting, and a proper saddle for Gentle Spirit. Whitman asked twice where the horses came from. I said only that they were payment for a debt. Not entirely untrue. The practical benefits of the Mustangs materialized faster than Sarah had anticipated. The territorial capital at Santa Fe had thriving horse markets where even unbroken Mustangs commanded good prices, and the distinctive markings of Nachkohe's herd drew particular interest. Sarah wasn't yet ready to part with many, but strategic trades and sales provided necessities that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. More surprising were the less tangible changes. Working with the horses required presence of mind, awareness of body language, and patience, qualities that pulled Sarah out of the numb detachment that had characterized her grief. The Mustangs didn't care about her past losses. They responded to who she was in the present moment, demanding authentic engagement rather than hollow routine. "Easy now," Sarah murmured, keeping her voice steady despite the sweat trickling down her back. The russet mare, storm dancer Nachkohe had called her, snorted and pawed the ground, eyes rolling to show the whites. Unlike most of the herd, this one had resisted all attempts at handling, shying away from human touch as if it burned. Sarah had been trying for over an hour, moving into the corral, then retreating when the mare showed signs of panic, gradually decreasing the distance between. Then with each attempt, her arms ached from holding them outstretched, palm up, in the non-threatening gesture Nachkohe had demonstrated. "I'm not giving up on you," she said softly, taking one small step forward. "You've got too much spirit to waste it on fear." The mare tossed her head, mane catching the afternoon light like copper wire. For a moment Sarah saw herself reflected in those wary eyes, the same defensive resistance, the same determination to keep the world at bay. How many people had tried to approach her after Thomas died, offering help she'd rebuffed out of pride or grief or some combustible mixture of both? Sarah stopped moving, a realization washing over her. She'd been applying Nachkohe's methods mechanically, following steps without understanding the underlying principle. The Apache hadn't just taught her horse training techniques. He demonstrated a way of being present, respectful, patient, but persistent. She exhaled slowly, allowing her shoulders to relax, consciously releasing the tension she'd been carrying. "I see you," she said to the mare, meaning it in a way she hadn't before. "I see your fear, and I'm still here." Something shifted in the air between them. Storm Dancer's ears, which had been pinned back defensively, twitched forward. The mare lowered her head slightly, nostrils flaring as she drew in Sarah's scent. Then so gradually it seemed to happen in slow motion, she took one step forward. Sarah remained perfectly still, hand extended, breathing evenly. Another step, and another. Until finally the mare's velvet nose brushed against her palm, warm, breath tickling her skin. "There you are," Sarah whispered, tears unexpectedly blurring her vision. "There you are." Copper Springs had grown in the months since Sarah's last visit. New construction lined the main street, a testament to the silver strike in the nearby hills that had revitalized the settlement despite the ongoing drought. Sarah rode Gentle Spirit confidently through town, leading 2 Mustangs on long lines behind her. The reaction was immediate and gratifying. Men stopped their work to appraise the horses, women paused in doorways, children pointed excitedly. These weren't the typical scrappy frontier horses, but magnificent creatures with distinctive coloring and proud bearing. "Mrs. Caldwell!" Marshal Jenkins called out, stepping from the sheriff's office. "Didn't expect to see you in town. Heard you were holding out in that valley all alone." Sarah reined Gentle Spirit to a stop. "News travels fast, Marshal, especially when it's carried by Jacob Whitman. He hasn't stopped talking about those horses you traded him." Jenkins circled the Mustangs appreciatively, said they were the finest stock he'd seen in years. Wouldn't say where you got them, though. Sarah kept her expression neutral. "Just good fortune, Marshal. The kind that comes when you least expect it." "Fortune indeed," Jenkins agreed, running a hand along one Mustang's flank. The black gelding tolerated the touch, but watched the man warily. "You looking to sell these 2? "Depends on the offer," Sarah replied. "I'm here to see the bank manager first, then perhaps visit the land office." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Land office? You thinking of selling out?" "Can't say I'd blame you with the drought and all." Sarah shook her head. "Quite the opposite. I'm looking to expand." The marshal's surprise was evident. "Expand? Into what? That whole area's been abandoned." "Exactly," Sarah said with a confidence she wouldn't have recognized in herself a month ago. "Which means the price should be reasonable." She left Jenkins staring after her as she continued down the main street toward the Territorial Bank. Inside, the same clerk who had denied her loan application after Thomas's death now straightened his waistcoat and offered her coffee. "Mrs. Caldwell, what a pleasant surprise. We don't often see residents from the outlying homesteads these days." "I imagine not," Sarah replied coolly. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Hargrove about establishing a proper account and perhaps discuss future business opportunities." The meeting that followed marked another turning point. Hargrove, the bank manager who had once dismissed Sarah as a doomed widow clinging to worthless land, now leaned forward with interest as she outlined her plans for a horse breeding operation. The 2 Mustangs she'd brought, left prominently visible through the bank's front window, provided tangible evidence of her claims. When she departed the bank 2 hours later, Sarah had not only opened an account with the proceeds from her previous horse trades, but had secured a tentative agreement for a small loan to purchase adjacent properties. The terms weren't generous, but they were fair, a reflection of her changing status from object of pity to potential business success. That night, sitting on her porch with a cup of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd been reduced to months earlier, Sarah pulled out Thomas's old map of the valley. With a pencil, she marked the properties she hoped to acquire: the Anderson place to the west with its deeper well, the Miller homestead to the north with the sturdy barn and bunkhouse that could eventually house ranch hands. The scope of her ambition should have terrified her. 6 weeks ago, she'd been contemplating abandoning everything. Now she was planning an enterprise that would require years of work and capital she didn't yet possess. Yet fear was noticeably absent, replaced by a steady determination she recognized. From her younger self, the woman who had agreed to leave Philadelphia society for an uncertain future on the frontier. A soft nickering from the corral drew her attention. Stormdancer stood at the fence, watching her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold Sarah accountable to her better nature. The mare had made remarkable progress, now allowing herself to be led with a rope halter, though riding remained. "A distant goal. We're both changing, aren't we?" Sarah said to the horse, letting go of old fears. The mare tossed her head as if in agreement, then turned to rejoin the herd. Sarah woke to a strange sound, a steady, insistent drumming on the cabin roof. For a moment, disoriented by sleep, she thought the Mustangs had somehow escaped and were running across the yard. Then a different possibility sent her scrambling from bed to the window. Rain. Real rain. Not the teasing sprinkles that had occasionally tormented the valley, but solid droplets falling in sheets from a sky dark with heavy clouds. Sarah threw open the door and stepped onto the porch, extending her hand to feel the cool moisture against her palm, watching as the parched earth darkened, absorbing the precious water. The Mustangs were in a state of excitement, running in circles around the corral, heads high, tails flagged. Thunder Voice led the celebration, rearing and trumpeting as if personally responsible for summoning the downpour. Sarah laughed aloud, a sound so foreign to her own ears that it startled her. How long had it been since she'd laughed? Since before. Thomas fell ill, certainly. Months of struggle and grief had robbed her of that simple joy, yet here it was, bubbling up unexpectedly like water from a hidden spring. She stood in the rain until her nightdress was soaked through, face tilted upward, letting the water wash away dust and weariness. Nakohe had been right. The rains had come before the first snow, just as he'd predicted. When she finally went inside to change into dry clothes, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin and paused, momentarily startled. The woman, looking back at her, was somehow both familiar and foreign, the same features she'd known all her life, but animated with an energy she hadn't seen since youth. The hollow-eyed ghost of recent months had been replaced by someone vital and present. The rain continued throughout the day, steady and nourishing. Sarah worked through it, making adjustments to ensure the water was channeled properly, relieved that she'd had the foresight to clear the irrigation ditches in anticipation of this moment. By noon, the dry creek bed had become a modest stream, water flowing where there had been only dust for seasons. The narrow passage to the hidden spring was treacherous with rain, slippery stone requiring careful navigation. Sarah made her way cautiously, drawn by a need to see how the rainfall had affected this place that had sustained her through the worst of the drought. The grotto had transformed. What had been a modest pool fed by a trickling waterfall was now a vibrant basin with water cascading down the rock face in multiple streams. The formerly subdued vegetation at the edges had already perked up, intensely green against the red stone. Sarah sat on a boulder at the water's edge, mesmerized by the dance of raindrops on the surface. This hidden sanctuary had shown her that sustenance could exist even when invisible to casual observation. Nakohe had understood this wisdom as inherent. Sarah had needed to learn it through desperate circumstances. "Thank you," she whispered, addressing the spring, the rain, the land itself, and perhaps the Apache who had revealed these mysteries to her. The words felt insufficient for the magnitude of her gratitude, but they were all she had to offer. The rain tapered off as sunset approached, clouds breaking to allow golden light to stream across the glistening landscape. Sarah completed her evening rounds, checking on the Mustangs, securing the homestead for the night. The air smelled different, clean, alive with potential, carrying the scent of damp earth and awakening plant life. She paused by the fence post, where Nakohe had left his final mark before departing. A small carved symbol she now recognized as a sacred sign for water and renewal. Her fingers traced the grooves, wondering when he would return as promised, what he would think of the changes she'd implemented, whether he would approve of her expanding ambitions. The Mustangs had settled for the night, huddled together in the familiar patterns of their social hierarchy. Thunder Voice stood slightly apart, ever vigilant. Storm Dancer had found her place among the other mares, no longer isolated by her fear. The herd had adapted to their new circumstances without abandoning their essential nature, a balance Sarah was learning to strike herself. Inside the cabin, Sarah made final entries in her journal by lamplight, documenting the rainfall measurements, the creek's revival, plans for tomorrow's work. The pages were filling rapidly now, ink replacing empty space, just as purpose had filled the void left by grief. November 9th, 1887. First significant rainfall. Creek flowing again, soil already showing signs of recovery, measured nearly 2 inches in the rain barrel. The Mustang sensed it coming yesterday, restless, alert. I should have recognized the signs. Tomorrow I'll ride to the Anderson property to assess its condition now that the rain has revealed which structures remained sound through the drought. The bank approved the purchase at yesterday's meeting, though Hargrove still believes I'm taking an unnecessary risk. Perhaps I am, but I've come to understand something about risk and safety. The drought taught me that what appears most secure can vanish overnight. The Mustangs have shown me that true security comes not from clinging to the familiar, but from adapting to change, from forming new connections, from trusting one's instincts in unfamiliar territory. Thomas would have understood this. Perhaps. He always did. She closed the journal and extinguished the lamp, but didn't immediately retire to bed. Instead, she stepped outside once more, drawn by the clarity of the post-rain sky. Stars emerged with startling brilliance, reflected in puddles that dotted the yard like scattered mirrors. The world had been transformed by water, just as Sarah had been transformed by circumstances she would never have chosen, but now wouldn't trade away. The drought had stripped her to essentials. What grew back was proving stronger, more resilient, more authentic than what had been lost. In the distance, a coyote called, a haunting sound that once would have underscored her isolation. Tonight it seemed more like a neighbor's greeting, acknowledging her place in this harsh but magnificent landscape. Sarah listened until the echoes faded, then turned toward the cabin, toward rest, toward whatever tomorrow might bring to this territory of wild mercy. But first, she moved deliberately to the ancient juniper that stood near the house, the one living thing that had survived the worst of the drought without human intervention. From her pocket, she withdrew the knife Nakohe had given her and carefully carved a small mark into the weathered bark, the Apache symbol for gratitude. A message for when he returned, a testament to the transformation that had occurred in his absence. A transformation not just of circumstance, but of spirit. The rains that broke the drought in early November brought life back to Salvation Valley, but they also carried unexpected consequences. 3 weeks after that first downpour, Sarah rode Gentle Spirit along the northern boundary of what was now her expanded property. The Anderson and Miller homesteads had been purchased, their abandoned structures gradually repurposed for her growing operation. The creek that had been a dusty scar was now a vigorous waterway, banks greening with new growth. Where parched earth had cracked and split, tender shoots pushed upward, painting the landscape with tentative color. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. But miracles, Sarah was learning, often attracted unwanted attention. She reined Gentle Spirit to a stop atop a small rise, gazing toward the eastern horizon where the territorial road wound its way toward Copper Springs. A dust cloud signaled approaching riders, the third group this week. Since word had spread about the Mustang herd and Sarah's surprising success, in the midst of regional hardship, visitors had become increasingly common. Some were harmless, curious neighbors returning to homesteads they'd abandoned, merchants hoping to secure business relationships, even a newspaper man from Santa Fe, interested in writing about the widow who defied the drought. Others were more troubling. Sarah pulled the Apache knife from the sheath she now wore at her belt and used it to cut a stem of prairie grass, examining the seed head thoughtfully. The knife had become both practical tool and talisman, a reminder of Nako's teachings and her own growing strength. She'd need both in the days ahead. She suspected the approaching riders resolved into 4 figures as they drew nearer, 3 men and a woman, moving with purpose rather than the casual pace of sightseers. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She recognized 2 of them, Lieutenant Crawford from the cavalry outpost near Copper Springs and Jacob Whitman from the Mercantile. The others were strangers. She tucked the knife away and nudged Gentle Spirit forward to intercept them. Better to meet them on open ground of her choosing than be cornered at the homestead. "Mrs. Caldwell," Whitman called as they approached, raising his hat in greeting. "Fine day for a ride," Sarah nodded, keeping her expression neutral though her pulse had quickened. "Mr. Whitman, Lieutenant, what brings the cavalry to Salvation Valley?" Lieutenant Crawford, a severe man with a waxed mustache and rigid posture, cleared his throat importantly. "Official business, ma'am. This is Indian Agent Pearson from the reservation north of here and Dr. Elizabeth Harding from the Department of the Interior in Washington." The woman, 40-ish, dressed practically, but with Eastern refinement evident in her tailored riding habit, offered a gloved hand. "Mrs. Caldwell, I've heard remarkable things about your operation here, particularly your horses." Sarah shook the hand briefly, sizing up the situation. "Word travels far these days." "Indeed it does," Agent Pearson interjected. He was a thin, sallow man with the pinched expression of someone perpetually displeased, especially when it concerns 30 purebred Apache Mustangs that disappeared from the reservation 3 months ago. The accusation hung in the air. Sarah kept her face, impassive though her mind raced. Nakohe had never mentioned a reservation connection to the horses. Had he deliberately misled her, or simply omitted relevant details? "My horses were a gift," she said carefully. "Fair compensation for aid rendered." "Aid to whom, exactly?" Lieutenant Crawford asked, his tone sharpening. Sarah met his gaze directly. "To a man who needed help. I didn't ask his business or origins." "Convenient," Pearson muttered. "And this man, did he happen to be Apache, perhaps going by the name Nakohe or Stalking Wolf?" The confirmation that they knew Nakohe by name sent a chill through Sarah. This wasn't a casual inquiry, but a targeted investigation. "I didn't catch his name," she lied, grateful that years of playing poker with Thomas had taught her to control her expressions. "He was injured. I offered assistance. He left the horses in return, simple as that." Dr. Harding studied Sarah with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Caldwell, no one is accusing you of wrongdoing. We're merely trying to establish facts. These horses represent a significant tribal asset, protected under federal oversight. Their removal from reservation land without proper authorization constitutes theft." "From what I understand," Sarah countered, "the Apache were a free people long before arbitrary boundaries were imposed on their ancestral territories. Perhaps these horses were theirs to begin with." Pearson's face darkened. "That kind of thinking breeds trouble, Mrs. Caldwell. The reservation system exists for a reason. Order, control, civilization. And yet," Sarah said mildly, "it seems to have failed rather spectacularly at preventing a starving Apache from being shot by a cavalryman and left to die on my property. Strange civilization." Lieutenant Crawford's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, though he didn't draw it. "You're admitting then that you harbored Nakohe. He's wanted for questioning in connection with several incidents, including the disappearance of these horses and an attack on a supply wagon." "I harbored an injured human being," Sarah replied, steel entering her voice, "as any Christian would be obligated to do. As for these alleged incidents, I know nothing about them." Dr. Harding raised a hand, interrupting what was clearly escalating into a confrontation. "Perhaps we might continue this discussion at your homestead, Mrs. Caldwell. I'd very much like to see these horses for myself. My department is particularly interested in indigenous breeding practices." The request was politely framed, but carried the unmistakable weight of government authority. Sarah had little choice but to agree. Of course, she said, turning Gentle Spirit toward home. Though I should warn you, the horses choose who they allow close. They're remarkably discerning. Thunder Voice sensed the tension immediately. The proud stallion positioned himself between the visitors and the rest of the herd, ears pricked. Forward, nostrils flared as he assessed these intruders. Behind him, the Mustangs had gathered in a defensive formation Sarah recognized from Nakohe's teachings. Mares and foals at the center, stronger horses at the perimeter. Magnificent, Dr. Harding breathed, observing from a respectful distance. Look at that conformation, the muscle development. These aren't ordinary Mustangs. That's because they're not, Agent Pearson said acidly. They're the result of generations of selective breeding by the Apache. The tribe considers them sacred animals, though that's superstitious nonsense, of course. Sarah bit back a sharp retort. Instead, she whistled softly, the signal she used to call Gentle Spirit. The dun mare immediately broke from the herd and trotted to her side, demonstrating the bond they'd developed. Sacred or not, Sarah said, stroking the mare's neck, they're intelligent beyond any domestic breed I've encountered. They remember kindness and cruelty equally well. Dr. Harding approached cautiously, hand extended palm up, in the manner Sarah herself had learned from Nakohe. To Sarah's surprise, Gentle Spirit allowed the woman to touch her, though she kept a wary eye on the men. You've developed quite a rapport with them, Dr. Harding observed, unusual for animals supposedly stolen just months ago. The subtle support in the comment wasn't lost on Sarah. Dr. Harding might be a government official, but she seemed to be forming her own conclusions. Lieutenant Crawford was less impressed. Rapport aside, Mrs. Caldwell, the fact remains that these horses are federal property by extension of their tribal ownership. Agent Pearson has the authority to reclaim them. On what grounds? Sarah demanded. I received them as legitimate payment. I have witnesses in town who can verify I've been trading and breeding them openly, not hiding them like stolen goods. The grounds, Mrs. Caldwell, Pearson said with exaggerated patience, are that Nakohe had no authority to remove them from tribal lands. He's not a chief or council elder, just a troublemaker with delusions of the old ways. Sarah's temper flared. The old ways kept his people alive for centuries before your reservation pens starved them into submission. Careful, ma'am, Lieutenant Crawford warned. That kind of talk sounds dangerously close to Indian sympathizing, not a healthy position in these territories. The implied threat hung in the air. Sarah was acutely aware of her vulnerability, a woman alone, defying government representatives. She might have local support from those who benefited from her horse trading, but that goodwill would evaporate quickly if she were branded an Indian sympathizer or, worse, accomplice to theft. Inside the cabin, seated around the table that Thomas had built from cottonwood, the conversation continued with misleading civility. Whitman had remained largely silent, his discomfort evident in his shifting posture and averted eyes. As a local merchant who had profited from deals with Sarah, he was caught between community ties and deference to authority. Let me be direct, Dr. Harding said, setting down the coffee cup Sarah had provided. The Department of the Interior is undertaking a comprehensive study of indigenous resource management, including horse breeding practices. These Mustangs represent a unique opportunity for documentation. Before they're confiscated, you mean, Sarah said flatly. Dr. Harding's expression revealed nothing. I'm not here to enforce policy, Mrs. Caldwell. My interest is scientific. And mine is practical, Pearson cut in. These horses must be returned to the reservation, where they can benefit the entire tribe, not just a renegade like Nakohe. Sarah studied the agent, noting the contradictions in his righteous concern. Strange that you're so passionate about tribal benefits, Mr. Pearson. I've heard conditions on the reservation are deplorable. Inadequate rations, contaminated water, rampant illness. Temporary challenges, Pearson dismissed with a wave. The point is, these horses belong under proper supervision. Your supervision, Sarah clarified. Federal supervision, Lieutenant Crawford corrected. And yes, Mrs. Caldwell, we have the authority to seize them. However, he glanced at Dr. Harding. Given the unusual circumstances and the department's interest, we're prepared to offer an alternative arrangement. Sarah waited, suspicion mounting. You may retain half the herd, Crawford continued, in exchange for your full cooperation with Dr. Harding's research and, most importantly, information regarding Nakohe's whereabouts and activities. And there it was. The real purpose behind this visit. The horses were leverage. Nakohe was the target. I told you, I don't know where he went, Sarah insisted, the lie now coming more easily. He left the horses and rode east. That's all I... No. Dr. Harding leaned forward, her scientific detachment giving way to genuine curiosity. Mrs. Caldwell, what exactly did Nakohe tell you about these horses? Their origins? Their significance to his people? Sarah hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. What had been meaningful exchanges with Nakohe could become dangerous information in the wrong hands. Yet Dr. Harding seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than exploiting. He said they weren't captured but asked. Sarah finally replied that they chose to come with him, that horses carry messages from the spirit world. Pearson snorted derisively. Typical superstitious nonsense. Is it? Dr. Harding challenged, surprising everyone. Indigenous ecological knowledge often contains sophisticated understanding of animal behavior coded in spiritual language. Mrs. Caldwell, did Nakohe demonstrate specific techniques for working with these horses? Before Sarah could answer, the sound of approaching riders interrupted the conversation. Through the window, she glimpsed 3 mounted figures approaching from the direction of Copper Springs, Marshal Jenkins and 2 deputies. Reinforcements? She asked Crawford coldly. The lieutenant looked genuinely surprised. Not of my requesting. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah rose, mind racing through options. She couldn't fight the combined authority of the Indian Agency, the cavalry, and local law enforcement. Yet surrendering the Mustangs, Nakohe's gift, her livelihood, and now her responsibility, was unthinkable. As Marshal Jenkins dismounted, in the yard, Sarah made a swift decision. She slipped Nakohe's knife from its sheath and pressed it into Dr. Harding's hand beneath the table, away from the men's sight. The Apache called this place the Mother's Hand, she whispered urgently. 5 canyons feeding one valley. The hidden spring is in the northwest canyon, behind the Red Rock Formation. If you truly care about knowledge rather than control, go there. See what I've seen. Dr. Harding's eyes widened slightly, but she concealed the knife in her sleeve with practiced discretion, just as Jenkins entered without knocking. Mrs. Caldwell, the marshal nodded grimly. Gentlemen, ma'am, I'm afraid we have a situation developing. Crawford stood. What kind of situation, Marshal? Reports of Apache warriors observed less than 10 miles north of here, Jenkins replied. A hunting party from the reservation, supposedly, but armed. Thought you should know, Lieutenant, given your current investigation. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. Pearson paled visibly, while Crawford's hand moved to his sidearm. How many? The lieutenant demanded. 6, according to my deputy who spotted them, led by a warrior called Stalking Wolf Nakohe. Sarah kept her expression neutral through supreme effort, though her heart raced. He had returned as promised, but into a dangerous situation neither of them had anticipated. We should return to town immediately, Pearson insisted, already gathering his hat. If those savages are raiding, they're hunting, not raiding, Sarah interrupted. As your deputy confirmed, on ancestral lands they've used for generations. Lands that are now under territorial jurisdiction, Crawford countered, and conveniently close to these disputed horses. The implication was clear. They suspected a coordinated effort to recover the Mustangs. Sarah needed to defuse the situation before it escalated into violence. "Marshal," she said with forced calm, "I've had peaceful dealings with the Apache in the past. Perhaps I could speak with them, explain the situation, avoid any unnecessary conflict." Jenkins looked skeptical. "You're suggesting we let you ride out to an armed Apache hunting party, alone?" "Not alone," Dr. Harding spoke up unexpectedly. "I'll accompany Mrs. Caldwell. As a federal representative, my presence would ensure proper protocols are observed. And frankly, gentlemen, a peaceful resolution would reflect better in my report to Washington than a needless confrontation." Her intervention surprised everyone, Crawford and Pearson most of all. The lieutenant sputtered objections about danger and protocol, but Dr. Harding calmly reminded him of her departmental authority. "The Interior Department outranks a frontier cavalry outpost, Lieutenant, and diplomatic solutions are always preferable to military ones, are they not?" They rode in silence for the first mile, Sarah on gentle spirit, Dr. Harding on her own serviceable gelding. Behind them the men remained at the homestead, Crawford insisting on examining the Mustang herd more thoroughly while awaiting their return. "They'll follow us soon enough," Dr. Harding said finally. "Crawford's not the type to let women handle negotiations, regardless of my position." Sarah nodded. "Then we'd better make good use of our head start." She guided Gentle Spirit off the main trail toward a rocky outcropping. "This way, it's faster." "To the Apache camp, or to somewhere else entirely?" Dr. Harding asked shrewdly. Sarah studied the older woman, reassessing her. "You're not what you appear to be, Dr. Harding." A small smile. "Few women in this world have the luxury of being exactly what they appear to be, Mrs. Caldwell. I suspect you understand that better than most." They crested a rise that offered a view back toward the homestead. The men appeared as distant figures, Crawford gesturing emphatically as Jenkins headed toward his horse. They had perhaps 15 minutes. Before pursuit began, Sarah made a decision. "There is no Apache hunting party." Dr. Harding raised an eyebrow. "No?" Then Marshal Jenkins' deputy saw exactly what Nakohe wanted him to see, Sarah finished. "Enough to report, not enough to engage. A diversion." Understanding dawned in the other woman's eyes. Clever. But why? Because Nakohe knew something. "Was wrong," Sarah said, pieces falling into place as she spoke. "He's been watching. He saw the government representatives arrive. He created a distraction to draw attention away from—" She paused, realization hitting her. "Away from the real objective. Which is—" Sarah wheeled Gentle Spirit around. "We need to get back to the homestead, now." They arrived to find the yard in chaos. The Mustang herd had somehow escaped their corrals and were circling the structures in coordinated patterns, effectively preventing Crawford and his companions from mounting their horses. Thunder Voice led the maneuver, directing the flow with powerful bursts of speed and strategic positioning. And standing calmly on the porch, as if he'd never left, was Nakohe. He wore different clothing than when Sarah had last seen him. More traditional Apache attire, including a medicine pouch prominently displayed. His posture radiated authority that hadn't been evident during his time of healing at the homestead. Crawford had drawn his pistol, but seemed uncertain whether to use it against the circling horses. Pearson cowered near the water trough, while Whitman and Jenkins simply stood back, watching the spectacle with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Hold your fire, Lieutenant," Sarah called out as she dismounted. "They won't harm you if you don't threaten them." Crawford's face was flushed with anger. "Control your horses, Mrs. Caldwell." "They're not just her horses," Nakohe said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the yard. "They belong to themselves first, to the earth and sky second, to the Apache." People third, his gaze moved to Pearson, not to corrupt agents who sell their rations and blame shortages on delivery problems. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Pearson sputtered denials, but his face had gone ashen. "What is he talking about?" Dr. Harding demanded, dismounting with surprising agility for a woman of her position. Nakohe reached inside his vest and withdrew a folded document. Evidence, supply manifests, receipts from merchants in 4 territories, names of army officers who shared in profits while my people starved. The revelation hung in the air like thunder. Crawford's hand tightened on his pistol, but uncertainty had replaced his earlier confidence. "Lies," Pearson managed weakly. "Indian fabrications. Government documents," Nakohe corrected, "with government seals, taken from government offices by those with access and conscience." He looked directly at Dr. Harding. "There are still some in your Washington who believe in justice, Doctor." The implications were staggering. Not just Pearson's corruption, but a network of officials profiting from reservation misery and sympathizers within the system working to expose them. The Mustangs, Sarah suddenly understood, had never been the real issue. They were a convenient pretext for investigating Nakohe, who possessed evidence that could bring down powerful men. "The horses were never stolen," Sarah said, pieces falling into place. "They were payment from someone inside the government who helped you obtain those documents." Nakohe nodded once, acknowledging her insight. "The horses chose to follow me, to help deliver truth that might save my people." He met Sarah's eyes. "Just as you chose to help a stranger, not knowing it would save you." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if Dr. Harding hadn't stepped forward, authority radiating from her posture, despite her gender and relatively small stature. "Agent Pearson," she said crisply, "consider yourself relieved of duty pending investigation. Lieutenant Crawford, you will escort him back to the territorial capital immediately. These documents," she took the papers from Nakohe with a nod, "of acknowledgement will be conveyed directly to the Secretary of the Interior under my personal seal." "You can't possibly believe," Crawford began. "I believe in evidence, Lieutenant," Dr. Harding cut him off. "And I've seen enough corruption in Indian affairs to find these allegations entirely credible. Marshal Jenkins, I trust you'll ensure everyone departs peacefully." Jenkins, a pragmatic man above all else, recognized the shifting balance of power. "Yes, ma'am. Lieutenant, I suggest you comply. This is well above our jurisdiction now." As the men reluctantly prepared to depart, Thunder Voice signaled to the herd, which parted to allow access to their horses. The choreographed precision of the movement reinforced what Sarah had come to understand. These were no ordinary animals, but partners in a mission whose scope had only now become clear. Standing beside Nakohe on the porch, as the government representatives rode away, Sarah felt as though she was seeing him truly for the first time, not as the wounded stranger she had saved, but as a man of purpose and vision, fighting for his people's survival with intelligence and strategic patience. "You knew," she said, quietly. "You knew they would come looking for the horses eventually, that they would lead to you." "I hoped," he corrected, "hoped that by then the truth would be ready to emerge." He looked out at the Mustangs, now calmly grazing as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Hoped that you would be ready as well." "Ready? For what?" Nakohe turned to face her fully, "to decide where you stand in the battle between truth and power, between those who would take and those who would share." He gestured toward the expanded homestead, the flourishing land. "You have built something meaningful here. Now you must choose what it will mean to others." As the implications of his words sank in, Sarah realized this was the true revelation, not just the exposure of corruption or the mystery of the Mustang's origins, but the recognition that her personal transformation carried with it a responsibility, larger than herself. The choice of what kind of world she would help create with the second chance she'd been given. Dr. Harding remained behind after the others departed, her official demeanor softening once they were alone. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, returning Nakohe's knife with a knowing look, "I believe we have much to discuss about the future of this remarkable place, and these remarkable horses." The sun was setting over Salvation Valley, painting the land in hues of amber and gold, reminiscent of that first evening when a wounded stranger had collapsed at Sarah's fence. Everything had changed since then, most of all Sarah herself, and as night fell, 3 figures sat around her table. The widow who had found her strength, the warrior who had brought truth as well as horses, and the scientist who saw value in ancient knowledge. Together, they began to map a new path forward, one that might honor both justice and mercy in this harsh but magnificent territory. Spring came early to Salvation Valley in 1888, as if nature were eager to compensate for the previous year's drought. The creek ran full and swift with snowmelt from the distant mountains. Fields once cracked and barren now sprouted with new. Growth and wildflowers carpeted the hillsides in riotous color. But the most remarkable transformation had occurred at the former Caldwell homestead, now known throughout the territory as Covenant Ranch. On a bright April morning, Sarah stood on the ridge overlooking her expanded property, hardly recognizing it as the desperate dying place she'd nearly abandoned 8 months earlier. The original cabin remained, preserved as a reminder of harder times, but it was now complemented by new structures. A larger main house constructed of local stone, expanded stables and corrals, and most significantly, a circular building of traditional Apache design situated near the creek. The Mustang herd had grown to nearly 50 animals with the birth of spring foals, their presence bringing vitality and purpose to land that had once seemed cursed. But it wasn't just horses that populated the ranch now. A dozen Apache families had established seasonal camps on the northern section, and representatives from 3 other tribes had visited in recent weeks, drawn by rumors of what was happening in this once-forgotten valley. Sarah checked her pocket. Watch, a recent indulgence purchased with proceeds from the ranch's first official horse auction. The territorial governor would arrive within the hour for the ceremony, along with representatives from Washington. After 4 months of planning and negotiation, today would mark the official opening of the Western Indigenous Horse Breeding and Agricultural Conservation Center, the first institution of its kind anywhere in the country. Thinking about running, away still, Nakohe's voice came from behind her, tinged with the subtle humor she'd grown to recognize over their months of working together. Sarah turned with a smile. "Every morning for at least 10 seconds, then I remember I have nowhere better to go." He joined her at the ridge, his appearance much changed from their first encounter. Though he still moved with the natural grace of a hunter, he now dressed in a practical blend of Apache and Western clothing that symbolized his dual role as liaison between cultures. The government papers in his saddlebag, official recognition as both tribal representative and federally appointed consultant, would have been unimaginable a year earlier. "The governor brings newspaper men," Nakohe observed, looking toward the eastern road. "Your face will be known beyond this territory after today. Yours too," Sarah reminded him. "Dr. Harding made sure your name appears first on all the official documents." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Elizabeth is skilled at battling old ways with their own weapons." He used the doctor's first name with the ease of genuine respect, a sign of how their unlikely alliance had solidified over months of strategic planning. Following the confrontation at the homestead last fall, Dr. Elizabeth Harding had proven herself an unexpected but formidable ally. The evidence Nakohe had gathered against Agent Pearson had indeed reached the Secretary of the Interior, triggering investigations that exposed corruption throughout the reservation system. But rather than stopping there, Dr. Harding had leveraged the scandal to propose a radical alternative, a demonstration project where indigenous knowledge could be preserved and documented while creating sustainable livelihoods. Sarah's ranch, with its miraculous recovery and unique Mustang herd, became the perfect location. The legal structure took months to establish, requiring acts of Congress, territorial exemptions, and creative interpretation of existing Indian affairs policies. The result was unprecedented, a privately owned ranch transformed into a quasi-governmental institution with tribal co-management, where indigenous horse breeding practices would be officially documented, taught, and sustained. "Second thoughts?" Sarah asked, noting Nakohe's contemplative expression as he surveyed the valley. "Not thoughts, memories." He nodded toward the distant foothills. "My grandfather brought me hunting here as a boy, before boundaries were drawn. On paper, before passes were required to walk ancestral lands." His expression remained neutral, but Sarah had learned to read the subtle shifts in his eyes. He would not understand this compromise, working with the same government that confined our people. "Is that how you see it? As compromise?" Sarah asked Nakohe. He considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "I see it as adaptation, the old ways preserved through new means." He turned to face her directly. "The Mustangs adapted when drought came. They didn't hold to old territories and die of thirst. They found new water, new patterns of survival." The comparison was apt. Over the winter months, as word of the venture spread, Sarah had watched Nakohe navigate between worlds with strategic brilliance, leveraging Washington's newfound guilt over reservation abuses to secure unprecedented concessions, while simultaneously maintaining the respect of tribal elders, skeptical of any arrangement with the government. It was a precarious balance, fraught with potential for misunderstanding on both sides, yet he maintained it with the same quiet confidence he showed when working with the Mustangs. "They're coming," Sarah noted, spotting dust on the eastern horizon, signaling approaching carriages. "Ready to make history?" Nakohe's expression remained serious. "History was not kind to my people the first time. We will see if second chances extend beyond this valley." The ceremony blended pageantry and practicality in a way that reflected the unique nature of the enterprise itself. Territorial officials in formal attire stood alongside Apache elders in traditional dress. Military officers who months earlier might have pursued Nakohe as a renegade now saluted him as an official liaison. Newspaper photographers documented everything, their magnesium flashes startling the Mustangs observing from nearby corrals. Governor Ellsworth, a political opportunist with aspirations to Washington, delivered a florid speech about new cooperation between America's original inhabitants and its forward-looking government. Though the words were hollow coming from him, the policies they represented, secured through Dr. Harding's relentless advocacy and careful legal work, were substantive enough to matter. When it came time for Sarah to speak, she kept her remarks brief and practical, focusing on the Mustangs' remarkable adaptability and the knowledge they represented, rather than her own unlikely journey. Public speaking remained uncomfortable, but like so many other challenges of the past year, she'd learned to face it directly. "These horses carry the wisdom of generations," she concluded, gesturing toward the corral where Thundervoice stood, watching the proceedings with regal detachment. Not just in their bloodlines, but in the methods required to work with them. Methods that demand partnership rather than dominance, respect rather than control. There are lessons here that extend far beyond horsemanship. The audience's polite applause turned to gasps of appreciation when Nakohe demonstrated those methods. Without saddle or bridle, using only subtle body language and the occasional soft word in Apache, he guided Thunder Voice through a series of movements that showcased the stallion's intelligence and training. Horse and man moved as extensions of each other, their communication nearly invisible to observers, yet resulting in flawless coordination. "Magic," whispered one of the Eastern reporters, frantically taking notes. "Science," corrected Dr. Harding, who had positioned herself near the press section. "Indigenous ecological knowledge refined over centuries of observation and practice. Precisely what this center will document and preserve." The formal ceremony concluded with the unveiling of the official charter, signed by the Secretary of the Interior and representatives from 3 tribal councils. Its carefully worded articles established an unprecedented arrangement: federal recognition of indigenous knowledge as valuable intellectual property, tribal access to ancestral lands without surrendering control to government agencies, and mechanisms for sustainable economic activity that didn't reduce native peoples to tourist attractions or laborers. As the official proceedings gave way to the more relaxed atmosphere of the reception, Sarah found herself momentarily alone near the refreshment tables. From this vantage point, she could observe the various factions mingling with varying degrees of comfort, military officers conversing stiffly with tribal elders, Eastern journalists eagerly questioning the Apache horse trainers who would serve as instructors, local ranchers assessing the facilities with the practical eye of competitors. "Quite a circus you've created, Mrs. Caldwell," came a familiar voice. Sarah turned to find Marshal Jenkins helping himself to punch, his expression wry but not unfriendly. "Not entirely my doing, Marshal," she replied. "Sometimes events take on their own momentum." Jenkins glanced toward Nakohe, who was speaking with the governor and 2 tribal representatives. "That's one way of putting it. 8 months ago he was a wounded fugitive, and you were a widow on the edge of ruin." He shook his head in amazement. "Now you're hosting governors and changing federal Indian policy. Makes a man wonder what's coming next," Sarah smiled. "Hopefully a much quieter summer focused on actual horse breeding rather than politics." The marshal's expression turned more serious. "Politics never really goes away, Mrs. Caldwell, especially not when you're challenging how things have always been done." He lowered his voice. "Not everyone's as pleased about this arrangement. As the speeches suggested, the cavalry outpost commander sees it as rewarding troublemakers. Certain business interests in the territory view tribal economic independence as a threat." "I'm aware," Sarah acknowledged, appreciating his candor. "We've taken precautions." Indeed, security had been a primary concern in the center's design. The main access road was highly visible for miles. Apache scouts routinely patrolled the perimeter, and most importantly, the hidden spring remained a closely guarded secret, known only to Sarah, Nakohe, and a handful of trusted others. Should outside water sources be compromised or access to the ranch blockaded, the spring would sustain both people and horses indefinitely. "Good," Jenkins nodded, "because progress has a way of stirring up resistance. Just ask Lincoln." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Harding approached, her practical travel outfit exchanged for a more formal dress suitable for the occasion. "Mrs. Caldwell, the Secretary's representative is asking for you. Something about touring the training facilities." As Sarah excused herself, she overheard Jenkins asking Dr. Harding about the prospects for similar arrangements in other territories. The physician-turned-bureaucrat's response was measured but optimistic, exactly the tone they had agreed to use with officials who might either support or undermine their work, depending on political winds. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of introductions, demonstrations, and carefully choreographed interactions designed to cement both governmental support and tribal participation. By sunset, when the last officials had departed for Copper Springs, Sarah felt drained yet oddly exhilarated. Months of planning, negotiating, and building had culminated in official recognition of a vision that had once seemed impossible. The celebration that followed was markedly different from the formal ceremony. With outside officials gone, the Apache, families who had established seasonal camps on the northern section of the ranch, gathered around fire pits, sharing food, music, and stories. Children who had been kept away from government representatives now ran freely between the campfires, some practicing with miniature versions of the halters used for training young Mustangs. Sarah sat somewhat apart, watching from the porch of her new stone house. Though she had been welcomed into these gatherings, she remained conscious of her status as an outsider granted rare privilege. The past months had taught her when to participate and when to respectfully observe. "Tired of being diplomatic?" Dr. Harding asked, joining her with 2 cups of coffee, stronger than the watered-down version served at the reception. "Exhausted," Sarah admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "I don't know how you manage it daily in Washington. I remind myself of the alternative," Elizabeth replied pragmatically. At 52, she had navigated male-dominated institutions. For decades, her medical credentials opening doors that remained closed to most women, her strategic intelligence keeping them open despite resistance. Discomfort is a small price for progress. They sipped their coffee in companionable silence, watching the celebration unfold. Across the yard, Nakohe was engaged in conversation with several tribal elders, his expression more animated than he typically allowed among white officials. Though he maintained his residence in a traditional dwelling near the horse enclosures, he and Sarah had developed a working partnership that transcended conventional definitions, not quite romantic, yet more intimate than mere colleagues, bound by shared purpose and mutual respect. "Will you stay through the summer?" Sarah asked. Knowing Elizabeth's position required her return to Washington soon, another week perhaps. Long enough to ensure the federal funding is properly established, she smiled wryly. "And to make sure our friend Lieutenant Crawford doesn't find creative ways to interfere once I'm gone." Crawford had been reassigned rather than dismissed following the Pearson investigation, a disappointment but not a surprise. The military establishment protected its own, and he had powerful family connections in the capital. His new posting kept him in the territory, but removed from direct authority over tribal matters. A compromise that satisfied no one entirely, but prevented immediate threats. "And then?" Sarah pressed. Elizabeth's expression softened slightly. "Then, I returned to bureaucratic battles, armed with evidence that cooperation yields better results than coercion. This center," she gestured toward the buildings and corrals, "will be my prime exhibit in budget hearings for years to come." "Assuming it succeeds." "It already has," Elizabeth countered firmly. "The Mustangs are thriving. Traditional knowledge is being documented rather than lost. Apache families have access to ancestral lands without military supervision." She set her cup down decisively. "The rest is just persistence." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only when one of the Apache women began a haunting song that caused conversations around the fires to still. The melody carried across the ranch yard, echoing off the distant hills, a sound that would have been forbidden on government reservations where traditional ceremonies were restricted, yet now rose freely into the night sky. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the unfamiliar harmonies wash over her. So much had changed, not just in the physical landscape, but in her understanding of what was possible when desperation gave way to vision. The drought that had nearly destroyed her had instead forced new connections, new adaptations, new ways of seeing the land and its people. As the song concluded, Nakohe approached the porch, his expression reflective. "That was a prayer of thanksgiving," he explained, taking a seat on the steps. "For water returned to dry places, for horses running, free on ancestral lands, for promises made and kept. Are you satisfied with today's outcome?" Elizabeth asked him directly, ever the pragmatist. Nakohe considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "Satisfied suggests completion. This is just beginning." He looked toward the mustangs, now shadowy forms in the twilight corrals. "But it is a beginning I did not think possible a year ago." "None of us did," Sarah agreed. The mustangs had been the catalyst, but the transformation extended far beyond horse breeding. What had started as one widow's desperate act of kindness had evolved into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about who controlled the land, whose knowledge had value, and what cooperation might look like beyond the rigid structures of conquest and submission. As darkness deepened, Elizabeth excused herself to review documents for the following day's meetings. Sarah and Nakohe remained on the porch, the comfortable silence between them a testament to months of working side by side through challenges both practical and political. "You should join the celebration," Sarah said eventually, nodding toward the fires where dancing had begun. "Soon," he agreed. "But first—" He reached into his vest and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather, similar to the knife he'd given her months earlier. "For you, to mark this day." Sarah unwrapped it carefully to reveal a carved wooden horse, small enough to fit in her palm but detailed with remarkable precision. The figure captured Thunder Voice's distinctive stance, head high, one foreleg raised, as if about to strike the earth. "It's beautiful," she said, running her finger along the smooth curves. "Did you make this?" Nakohe nodded. "From the juniper where you carved the gratitude symbol." His expression remained composed, but something in his eyes conveyed deeper meaning. "The old ones say that to capture a creature's spirit in wood is to honor its medicine, its power to change lives." "The Mustang certainly changed mine," Sarah acknowledged, thinking of how far she had come from that desperate night when she'd given away her only horse to a dying stranger. "Not the Mustangs alone," Nakohe said quietly. "Your choice, to help without knowing the outcome, to give without certainty of return." He gestured toward the ranch, the fires, the horses. All this grew from that moment. The observation struck closer to Sarah's heart than she had expected. She had grown accustomed to focusing on practical matters: water rights, construction timelines, legal documents, breeding records, deliberately avoiding reflection on the deeper changes within herself. Yet Nakohe, in his characteristically direct way, had identified the essential truth. Her transformation had begun not with the Mustang's arrival, but with her own decision to act with compassion when pragmatism dictated otherwise. "We should join them," she said finally, tucking the carving carefully into her pocket. "It's your celebration as much as anyone's." Nakohe rose, offering his hand with the formal courtesy he reserved for significant moments. "Ours," he corrected. "The path forward has many footprints." Together, they walked toward the gathering, where the dancing had grown more energetic, firelight casting elongated shadows across the ranch yard. Some of the younger Apache men had brought out drums, their rhythm matching the heartbeat of the land itself. As they approached, the dancing paused briefly. An elder stepped forward, speaking rapidly in Apache to Nakohe, who listened with evident respect before responding in the same language. The exchange concluded with nods of agreement, and the elder turned to Sarah. "He wishes to honor the woman who sheltered the wounded wolf and received the horse nation in return," Nakohe translated. It is customary to give a name that reflects one's true nature. Sarah hadn't anticipated this development, but recognized its significance. Names held power in Apache culture, often changing throughout life to reflect new roles or insights. The elder spoke again, this time more formally, gesturing toward the Mustangs, the land, and finally, Sarah herself. "He names you she who bridges worlds," Nakohi translated, a rare smile briefly illuminating his features. "It is a good name, a true name." Around the fires, the gathered Apache repeated the name in their language, the syllables flowing like water over stone, not assimilation, not conquest, but acknowledgement, recognition that different ways of being could exist side by side, that bridges could be built where walls had failed. As the drums resumed and the dancing continued, Sarah stood at the edge of firelight and shadow, acutely aware of the invisible boundaries she had crossed and those that remained. The formal charter signed earlier that day created legal frameworks for cooperation, but the true work of understanding across cultures would continue for generations. She had not been liberated from the past so much as given responsibility for a different future. Thunder Voice's distinctive whinny carried from the nearby corral, as if the stallion were offering his own acknowledgement of the proceedings. The sound rippled through the celebration, drawing smiles and nods of recognition. The Mustangs remained at the center of this unlikely alliance, living embodiments of adaptation, resilience, and the wild spirit that refused confinement. Dawn would bring new challenges, political machinations from Washington, local resistance to changing power dynamics, the practical difficulties of establishing breeding programs that honored traditional knowledge while meeting modern needs. The path ahead would not be smooth or certain, but tonight, under stars that had witnessed centuries of human struggle across these territories, Sarah allowed herself to fully inhabit the moment, to recognize that true liberation came not from absence of constraints but from choosing which bonds to honor. The drought that had nearly destroyed her had instead revealed deeper aquifers of strength. The mercy she had shown to a wounded stranger had returned multiplied beyond imagination. And as the night deepened around the celebration, the Mustangs stood watch from their corrals, free yet choosing to remain, their wild wisdom a testament to the power of choice in determining captivity or liberty, isolation or connection, mere survival or genuine thriving in this harsh but magnificent landscape. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.